August 1944. Brittany, France. The dust came first. It always did. Before the engines, before the grinding of gears on broken asphalt, before the low mechanical thunder that made windows vibrate in their frames, the dust arrived like a pale messenger, rolling across the fields in long horizontal curtains. Farmers who had survived 4 years of occupation had learned to read it. Dust from the east meant Germans retreating. Dust from the west, in August of 1944, meant something else entirely. It meant the Americans were coming. And in the summer of liberation, those 2 words, the Americans, carried the weight of answered prayers. Corporal Thomas Cole was sitting in the cab of the second truck in a convoy that stretched nearly 2 miles behind him when the column shuddered to a stop. He didn't think much of it at first. Columns stopped. Tires blew. Bridges were narrower than maps suggested. A goat wandered onto the road somewhere ahead, and nobody wanted to run over a French goat in liberated France. You waited. You drank water from your canteen. You watched the clouds move over fields that looked impossibly green for a continent at war. But this stop was different. After 5 minutes, Cole climbed down from the cab. After 10, he started walking forward. 180 yards ahead, past a row of trucks idling in the morning heat, past soldiers who had given up waiting and were sitting on the ground eating rations, past Lieutenant William Hart of Columbus, Ohio, who was standing with his hands on his hips, staring at something with the expression of a man who has run out of reasonable options. Past all of this, Cole saw the man. He was standing in the middle of the road. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, a tie that had been knotted with obvious care. He was perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair pressed flat under a hat he must have retrieved from some protected shelf for precisely this occasion. Behind him, stretching across the entire width of the road, stood a wooden barricade. Behind the barricade, a village. Perhaps 40 or 50 stone buildings clustered around a church whose bell tower caught the morning light and held it. The man did not move. He was not armed. He was not a soldier. He was not a partisan, not a collaborator, not a bureaucrat with papers to inspect. He was, as Lieutenant Hart would write in his report later that afternoon, the mayor of the village of Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer, and he appeared to have no intention whatsoever of stepping aside. Cole stood there for a moment, looking at this scene, the endless column of American military hardware pressing against a single man in a suit, and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not frustration, not even confusion exactly. Something closer to recognition. There was a village 7 kilometers to the north called Plounévez-Quintin. It no longer matters whether you can pronounce the name. What matters is what happened there 9 days before Thomas Cole climbed out of his truck. A different convoy, moving fast, moving east, had passed through Plounévez-Quintin on a gray morning when the road curved sharply past the western edge of the village cemetery. The convoy had not slowed for the curve. The third vehicle, a heavy supply truck carrying ammunition, had taken the turn wide. The outer rear wheels had caught the low stone wall that bordered the cemetery, and the wall had crumbled along a 12-foot section as easily as if it had been made of chalk. The wall had stood since the time of the Revolution. It had survived artillery from 3 different wars. It had been built by men whose grandchildren's grandchildren were buried behind it. It had been repaired twice in living memory, once after a lightning strike in 1912, and once after a German vehicle had struck it in the first winter of the occupation. And now it was rubble at the side of a road, and the convoy was already around the next curve, the soldiers inside not knowing, not having felt even a tremor through the vehicle's chassis. The Americans had not done it deliberately. This is important. There was no malice in it, no contempt. They didn't know what they had hit, and by the time they might have thought to wonder, the village was 3 kilometers behind them. War moves fast. War does not have time to check its rearview mirror. The mayor of Plouneves-Quintin had written a letter. He had addressed it carefully to the American military command. He had described the wall, its age, its significance, the names of families whose graves now lay exposed to the road. He had not accused. He had not demanded. He had asked, with the careful dignity of a man who understood that armies do not exist to repair cemetery walls, whether something might be done. No answer came. It was this letter, passed village to village the way such things travel in places where everyone knows everyone, that reached Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer 2 days before the convoy arrived. It was this letter that Henri Moreau had read at his kitchen table 3 times, folding it carefully between each reading. And it was this letter that he had been thinking about when he went to his armoire that morning, looked at his work clothes and his good suit, and chose the suit. Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer had 180 residents, 1 well, 1 road, 1 church built in 1632, its stone walls carrying 3 centuries of Breton weather in their gray face. The village also had 1 water pipe, a ceramic pipe installed in 1921 that ran directly beneath the main road at its narrowest point, where the church wall pressed close on one side and the school wall pressed close on the other. The pipe supplied water to 63 of the 180 residents, including both the school and the church. It was, as pipes go, unremarkable. It was also, as Henri Moreau had calculated, with the kind of slow, thorough arithmetic that comes from a lifetime of managing things that cannot easily be replaced, not repairable in any time frame shorter than several weeks, possibly months, if a column of heavy military vehicles passed over it at speed. He had measured the road with a piece of string the previous evening, walking the distance alone in the gray dusk. He had looked at the convoy routes marked in chalk on the wall of the old post office, where the Americans had placed a routing notice 3 days prior. He had done the mathematics of weight and pressure and ceramic pipe in a way that required no engineering degree, only the common sense of a man who had watched the same road crack and heave through 40 winters. Then he had gone home, told his wife he would be late for dinner, set his alarm clock for 6 in the morning, and laid his good suit across the chair beside the bed. He was on the road by 6:45. By 7:15, he had constructed a barricade from 3 wooden sawhorses and a length of rope. By 8 o'clock, the first American vehicles had come around the bend to the west and stopped. By 8:15, Lieutenant William Hart, 26 years old, 4 months in France, with a French phrase book he had bought in London and an expression of increasingly desperate goodwill, was standing 2 feet from Henri Moreau, trying to explain, in the mixture of broken French and gestures that had become the lingua franca of liberation, that there was a war on. Moreau understood. He nodded at each point. He acknowledged the war. He acknowledged the urgency. He acknowledged, with a slight tilt of his head, that Hart found deeply unnerving, that he understood completely the position of the American army and respected it enormously. Then he said, with the patience of a man who has already thought through every counter-argument, "None." The column waited. Engines idled. Soldiers ate their rations and looked at the sky. Somewhere behind the barricade, in the village that smelled of bread and stone and something flowering that none of the Americans could identify, life continued at its own pace, indifferent to the 2 miles of military hardware sitting in the August heat. Hart radioed his battalion commander. The battalion commander arrived and tried. He was a reasonable man. He offered assurances, documentation, personal guarantees. He explained the military situation in terms he believed were clear. None. The world did not stop for a mayor in a suit on a road in Brittany. Except that, for 6 hours, it did. 8 o'clock in the morning had become 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun had moved across the sky with the indifferent precision it always maintains, regardless of what human beings are doing beneath it. The shadows of the church tower had rotated like the hand of a slow clock, sweeping across the cobblestones of Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer in a long arc that marked the hours better than any watch. Soldiers who had started the morning sitting on their helmets eating rations had long since finished eating, had slept, had woken, had eaten again, and were now sitting with the hollow-eyed patience of men who have learned that waiting is simply another form of work. Henri Moreau had not moved. This was the detail that kept circulating through the column, passed from truck to truck, the way rumors travel through any confined space, not as information exactly, but as a kind of collective bewilderment seeking company. He hasn't moved. Soldiers who had been at the front of the column walked back to tell soldiers at the rear. Soldiers at the rear walked forward to see for themselves and came back with the same expression, a mixture of exasperation and something that, had you pressed them to name it, they might reluctantly have called respect. He stood. He waited. He had brought water in a ceramic jug, which he had set beside the central sawhorse with the matter-of-fact preparation of a man who had always known this would take a while. Lieutenant William Hart was now on his 4th conversation with his battalion commander, and the battalion commander was having his 2nd conversation with the regimental commander, and somewhere in this chain of escalating frustration, a staff officer had begun preparing a memorandum about civilian obstruction of military movement, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of admitting that nobody had any idea what to do. Hart had tried everything in the phrasebook. He had gone beyond the phrasebook. He had used his hands, his map, his watch, pointing to the positions and the distances, and the time that was bleeding away with every quarter hour the column sat still. He was not an impatient man by nature. His mother had described him, in letters that arrived with cheerful regularity from Columbus, as the most steady person I have ever raised. But 6 hours of none from a man in a suit had begun to wear at even his considerable composure. What made it worse was that Moreau was not hostile. He was not angry. He did not shout, did not gesture dramatically, did not perform his refusal for an audience. He simply refused, with the calm consistency of a man executing a decision he had already fully made, and no new argument caused even a ripple of reconsideration in his expression. He listened to every point. He nodded at several. He remained utterly, serenely, immovably none. The regimental commander, Colonel David Stevenson, had arrived at 12:30 with the energy of a man who has resolved similar problems before and expects to resolve this one in roughly the same time frame. He had not resolved it. Stevenson was 51 years old, a veteran of the previous war, a man who had spent 3 decades learning that most obstacles dissolve when you apply the right combination of authority and reasonableness in the correct sequence. He had authority. He had reasonableness. He had applied both, individually and in combination, across 40 minutes of conversation with Henri Moreau through the imperfect medium of a French-speaking corporal from Louisiana, whose Cajun accent confused Moreau nearly as much as the original English had. Moreau had explained the pipe. He had explained it simply, without drama, the way an engineer explains a load-bearing wall to someone holding a sledgehammer. He had drawn a rough diagram in a small notebook he produced from his jacket pocket, the road, the pipe beneath, the dimensions, the weight estimates he had calculated. He had shown Stevenson this diagram with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his numbers are correct and is willing to wait for that knowledge to be acknowledged. Stevenson had looked at the diagram. He had conferred with his own engineers, who had looked at the diagram, looked at the road, looked at each other, and said something in the careful tonal range of men who do not wish to confirm that a civilian in a suit has correctly identified a problem that they had not considered. What they said, in essence, was, he might not be wrong. Stevenson had then offered to have American military engineers assess and reinforce the pipe before the column passed. This was, he believed, an entirely reasonable solution. Moreau had thanked him for the offer. Then he had asked how long American military engineers would require to assess and reinforce a ceramic water pipe installed in 1921. Stevenson had consulted his engineers again. The engineers had said 48 to 72 hours. Moreau had nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he had said that he appreciated the offer very much, and that the answer was still no. None. It was at this point that Stevenson had done something that none of the officers involved in the preceding 6 hours had done. He had stepped back from the barricade, walked 20 meters down the road away from the convoy, and stood alone for approximately 4 minutes looking at the field beside the road. Then he had walked back to his jeep and reached for the radio. The call reached 3rd Army headquarters at 14:17. The duty officer who received it was a captain named Reynolds, and he would later say that the call was one of the stranger things he had logged in 4 months of duty. A regimental commander, reporting that a convoy of substantial size and strategic importance had been stationary for 6 hours because one civilian was standing in the road. No violence, no threat, no organized resistance. One man, one barricade made of sawhorses. Reynolds had written it down carefully, read it back to confirm he had the details correct, and then carried it personally to the operations room, because it was the kind of report that seemed to require a human hand rather than a telephone. The operations room at 3rd Army in August of 1944 was not a quiet place. It was a room in which the movement of tens of thousands of men across hundreds of miles of French countryside was tracked, adjusted, argued over, and decided. Pins moved on maps. Numbers changed on boards. Officers spoke in the compressed shorthand of men who have too much information and not enough time. The room had the specific atmosphere of controlled urgency that becomes, after enough weeks, simply the baseline texture of existence. General George Patton was standing at the main map when Reynolds brought him the report. He read it once. Then he looked up at Stevenson's name at the top of the report, as if checking that he had the correct Stevenson. Then he read it again. 6 hours, he said. It was not a question. Yes, sir, Reynolds said. The column has been stationary since approximately 0800. Patton looked back at the map. His finger moved to the position of the convoy, then traced the road east, calculating, as he always calculated, in distances and times and the cost of hours. Every hour the column sat still was miles it was not covering. Miles that translated into positions, positions that translated into everything, that positions translate into in a war. What's the obstruction? Reynolds explained. The pipe, the church, the school, the water supply. 180 residents, one mayor. Patton was quiet for a moment. Colonel Stevenson, who had driven to headquarters rather than trust this particular conversation to the radio, was standing near the door. He had prepared, during the drive, a thorough summary of everything that had been tried, the reasons each approach had failed, and a proposal to route the heavy vehicles around the village via a farm track that his maps showed running parallel approximately 4 kilometers to the south. It was a good proposal. It had taken him most of the drive to work out the details, and he was reasonably confident it would resolve the situation without further escalation. The bypass route would add approximately 2 hours to the convoy schedule, he said, but it would. How long has he been standing there? Sir, since 8 o'clock this morning, roughly 6 hours. Patton looked at the ceiling for approximately 1 second. It was a characteristic gesture, not doubt, not hesitation, but the brief internal moment of a man whose decisions arrive fully formed and simply need 1 second to settle before being spoken. "Get my Jeep," he said. Stevenson took a breath. "Sir, I have a proposal for the bypass route that would avoid the need to—" "It's been 6 hours, Colonel." 4 words. The bypass proposal, which had been constructed with genuine care during a 20-minute drive, did not survive them. Word traveled back through the column faster than any radio signal. Patton's coming. It moved from the front vehicles to the rear in a ripple, the way information moves through any long line of people who have been waiting together long enough to feel collectively invested in the outcome. Soldiers who had been sleeping against their truck tires sat up. Men who had been playing cards put the cards away. There was a general straightening that was not quite standing at attention, but carried the same impulse. At the barricade, Henri Moreau heard nothing of this. He stood, as he had stood for 6 hours, with the patient stillness of a man whose position has not changed and who sees no reason why it should. His water jug was nearly empty. His suit jacket, which he had kept buttoned through the August heat with a determination that several soldiers had observed and silently admired, remained buttoned. He watched the road to the west. After a few minutes, a jeep appeared around the bend. It drove the length of the column at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, the pace of someone arriving with intention rather than urgency. It stopped 15 meters from the barricade, 3 stars on the helmet. Moreau had never met a general. He had seen photographs, had read newspapers, had the general understanding of rank and insignia that any man of his generation carried. He recognized what 3 stars meant. He looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at the face beneath the helmet, and then he looked back at the road directly in front of him. He did not move. The general climbed out of the jeep. He was tall, and he walked the 15 meters to the barricade with a stride that covered ground efficiently without appearing to hurry. He stopped 2 meters from Moreau and looked at him. Then he looked past him at the village, the church tower, the school, the houses pressed close along the road's edge. He looked at these things with the careful attention of a man making an assessment rather than a performance. Then he looked at Moreau again. Between them, 2 meters of August air, a wooden sawhorse, and 6 hours of collective failure by every intervening layer of military authority. Neither man spoke first. They simply stood, regarding each other with the mutual recognition of 2 people who have, by entirely different routes, arrived at the same understanding, that whatever was going to happen next, it was going to happen here, between them, and it was not going to be resolved by rank alone. Somewhere behind the barricade, a church bell began to count the hour. 2 o'clock. The shadows of Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer lay long and still across the cobblestones. The convoy waited. The dust settled. A continent held its breath. The first thing Patton did was not speak. This surprised everyone who was close enough to observe it. The soldiers who had edged forward along the column, the sergeants who had found reasons to be near the front, Lieutenant Hart, who had spent 6 hours in this exact spot and felt a proprietary interest in its resolution. All of them had expected words. Commands, perhaps, or the particular tone of authority that makes further argument feel structurally impossible. Patton had a reputation that preceded him the way weather precedes a storm front, and the men who served under him had developed specific expectations about how he handled obstacles. He did not handle this one with words. He stood for approximately 30 seconds looking at Henri Moreau. Not through him, not past him, not at the barricade or the village behind it. At him. The way you look at something you are trying to understand, rather than something you are trying to move. Then he turned to the sergeant standing at his left shoulder. Jean Lacroix, 28 years old, born in Boston to a mother from Lyon, had spent the last 4 months serving as a French interpreter for Third Army, and had developed, across those months, a finely calibrated sense of when situations were about to become complicated. He had been in this convoy's vicinity for the last 40 minutes, summoned forward when word reached headquarters that the civilian in question spoke no English whatsoever. He was now standing very still, waiting. "Tell him my name," Patton said, "my rank, and tell him I've heard about the pipe." Lacroix translated. Moreau listened with his eyes on Patton's face rather than on Lacroix's, the way people do when they want to read the speaker directly. When Lacroix finished, Moreau responded in 3 sentences. "He says," Lacroix said carefully, "that he knows your name, General. He says he has known for 2 days that this convoy was coming, and he says that knowing your name does not change the pipe." There was a brief silence along the front of the column. Patton looked at Moreau for another moment. Then something happened in his expression that Hart, watching from 8 meters back, would describe in his report that evening as difficult to characterize precisely, but not displeasure. "Fair enough," Patton said. "Ask him about the church." This was the first round, and it did not go the way military logic would have predicted. Patton was not a man who wasted time on preamble, and he did not waste it here. He had been briefed during the drive, 15 minutes at speed over roads that rewarded brevity, on the essential facts: pipe, church, school, water, 180 people. One man making a calculation about what mattered more than the other calculations being made around him. He began with money because money was concrete and could be moved fast. 700 francs now. Immediate payment, in cash, from military funds designated for civilian damages. Full repair of the water pipe within 24 hours, guaranteed in writing by his own authority, which meant it would happen in 24 hours regardless of what the engineering schedule said, because when Patton put something in writing, the engineering schedule rearranged itself accordingly. He stated these terms clearly, without flourish, the way a man states facts he considers self-evidently reasonable. Moreau listened to the full translation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Lacroix to ask the general one question. "What is the age of the pipe?" Patton glanced at Lacroix. Lacroix looked at Moreau. "He wants to know the age of the pipe, sir." 23 years, Hart called from behind, checking his notes. Moreau nodded slowly when this was translated. Then he spoke for somewhat longer than he had spoken before, and Lacroix listened with the focused attention of a man making sure he gets the translation precisely right. "He says," Lacroix said, "that the money is generous. He says he believes you would repair the pipe. He says 23 years is not very old for a pipe, and a repaired pipe is still a pipe." He paused. Then he says, "The church is 1632. Patton waited. "He says a repaired church is not a church." The sentence landed in the August heat and stayed there. Patton did not argue it. He did not counter it, did not redirect it, did not produce a military framework within which the distinction between a pipe and a church could be administratively resolved. He simply accepted it, the way a man accepts a statement of fact that has been correctly made, and moved on. "All right," he said. "No money." He said it without frustration. This was the detail that Lacroix would remember most clearly when he described the conversation years later. Not the words themselves, but the complete absence of impatience in them. Patton had offered something reasonable. It had been declined for reasons he now understood, and he was done with that line of approach. The efficiency was almost impersonal. "Tell him I want to walk through the village." This was the second round, and it was conducted almost entirely in silence. Moreau heard the translation and was visibly surprised. He looked at Lacroix, then at Patton, then at the barricade behind him, as if recalculating something. He asked one question. Why? Patton answered it in 4 words. To see what he sees. There was a pause while Lacroix translated this, and Moreau absorbed it. Then Moreau did something he had not done in 6 hours. He moved. He stepped to the side of the central sawhorse and gestured with a slight inclination of his head toward the gap. Patton stepped through. He left Lacroix on the convoy side. He left Hart. He left his aide. He left the driver who had brought him here. He walked through the barricade alone and fell into step beside Henri Moreau, and the two of them moved together into the village of Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer, while 2 miles of American military machinery sat on the road behind them and waited. The soldiers who watched them go would later struggle to describe exactly what was striking about the image. 2 men walking, a dirt road between stone buildings, afternoon light, nothing dramatic in the physical arrangement of it, and yet something about it held the eye in the way that certain things do, not because they are large, but because they are exactly right. Patton looked at everything. He looked at the road surface, the way a man looks at something he is measuring with his eyes. He looked at the width between the church wall on the left and the school wall on the right, and the visible narrowing where the 2 buildings pressed closest together. He crouched once, briefly, and pressed his palm flat against the road surface with the focused attention of a man listening for something below it. He said nothing. He asked nothing. He simply walked and looked, matching his pace to Moreau's pace, which was the unhurried pace of a man on familiar ground. Moreau walked without speaking either. He did not point things out, did not offer commentary, did not perform the village for his guest. He simply walked and let the village be itself, trusting, with what turned out to be correct instinct, that a man paying genuine attention would see what needed to be seen without being directed toward it. They passed the well. Patton paused at it for a moment, looking at the rope and the wooden cover and the stones worn smooth at the rim by generations of hands. He did not comment. He walked on. They passed the school. Through the window, visible in the afternoon light, small desks stood in rows, a blackboard with something still written on it in white chalk. Mathematics. Moreau's eyes moved to the window and then away, the automatic glance of a man who has passed this window 10,000 times. They reached the church. Patton stopped. He stood in front of the entrance and looked up at the facade with his head tilted back slightly, taking in the full height of it. 1632 was cut into the stone above the doorway, and the cut was weathered but legible, the numbers carrying their age in the slight softening of their edges. He read the date. He looked at the walls. He looked at the place where the road pressed closest to the foundation, the place where 3 centuries of stone met the road surface with approximately the margin of a man's outstretched hand. He was quiet for a long time. Then he turned and looked back the way they had come, at the road they had walked, at the narrowing between the buildings, at the geometry of the problem laid out in real stone and real distance rather than in the abstractions of a map. He turned back to the church. He looked at the foundation again. He did not speak for another full minute. Moreau stood beside him and waited. He had, by this point, been standing or walking in the service of this problem since before 6 o'clock in the morning. He was not tired, or rather, he was tired in the way that people are tired when they are doing something necessary, a tiredness that exists beneath the surface of the thing and does not interfere with it. Patton finally looked at him, not at the church, not at the road, at him, at the face of the man who had put on his good suit and walked out to the road before 6:45 in the morning and had not moved for 6 hours. He nodded once. A single, slow nod. Then he turned and started back toward the barricade. The third round lasted 11 minutes, and it solved everything. They were standing again at the barricade, Lacroix between them, the convoy visible behind, the village visible ahead. Patton spoke without preamble. Heavy vehicles, trucks carrying supplies, the larger transport units, would take the bypass route to the south, 4 kilometers longer, 2 hours added to the schedule. He had already decided this during the walk, he said, though he did not say exactly when. During the walk, it had become decided. Light vehicles would pass through the village, but not at convoy speed, at walking pace, and not under American direction. Each vehicle that entered Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer would be guided through by residents of the village, one person on each side of each vehicle, walking alongside it, controlling the pace. American soldiers would not direct their own passage through this place. The people of the village would direct it. Moreau listened to this through Lacroix with the careful focus he had given to everything. When the translation was complete, he asked one question. He asks, "Who chooses the guides?" "His people," Patton said immediately. "Whoever he wants. We don't choose them. We don't brief them. They walk, we follow their pace. If they stop, we stop." Another question. He asks about the pipe. He still wants to know about the pipe. Military engineers will assess it before the first vehicle enters. If they say it's at risk, the light vehicles go south with the heavy ones. All of them. He paused. If the engineers say it holds, we go through. If they're wrong, I fix it. Personally accountable. My name on it. Lacroix translated. Moreau was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that Lacroix would later say caused him to take a slightly longer breath before translating. He says, "You are a general. You are fighting a war. You have many things. Why did you come here yourself?" The column was very quiet. The engines that had been idling for 6 hours had been cut at some point in the last hour, and the silence they left behind was the particular silence of a large number of people listening to something small. Patton looked at Moreau for a moment. Then he looked at the church tower. Then he looked back. He spoke slowly, and Lacroix translated in segments, and the words moved between the two men with the careful passage of something that needed to arrive intact. "This is his village," Patton said. "Not mine, not the army's. His. He has kept it for 4 years. He has kept that church, that school, that pipe, those 180 people, through 4 years of occupation and war. He has kept all of it." He paused. "A man who will not fight for his own things is not worth fighting for. He is worth fighting for." So he deserved an answer from someone who understood that. He paused again. He didn't need a lieutenant. He needed someone who would come out here and walk the road and see what he sees. "That's why I came." Lacroix finished the translation. Moreau listened to the last word. He stood very still for a moment. His expression did not change in the large theatrical way of dramatic scenes. It changed in the small way that faces change when something lands in exactly the right place. He turned to the barricade. He moved the first sawhorse himself, then the second, then the third. He coiled the rope with the methodical care of a man who intends to return it to its proper storage. He set the sawhorses at the side of the road. The road was open. It took just under 3 hours. The engineers assessed the pipe in 40 minutes and said it would hold light vehicles at walking pace. They were correct. The residents of Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer chose their own guides, 12 people in total, working in rotating pairs, one on each side of each vehicle. They included a woman of approximately 70, who had apparently been waiting at her doorway for some time, and 2 boys of perhaps 12 who took their assignment with the gravity of people given genuine responsibility. Every vehicle that entered the village moved at walking pace. No stone was touched, no wall was grazed. The church stood as it had stood since 1632, indifferent to the passage of armies in the manner of things built to outlast them. The last light vehicle to pass through the village was a jeep. As it came even with the church, something came through the window. A bottle of wine, passed out to a hand that happened to be there. No words. One nod. The bottle was from Moreau. No one needed to be told. Lieutenant Hart's report, filed that evening at 2100 hours, contained a paragraph near the end that his commanding officer read twice and then forwarded up the chain without comment. It read, in its entirety, "The resolution of the Saint-Éloi obstruction may serve as a model for similar civilian-military conflicts in densely populated liberated areas. Recommend review for application in standing orders regarding civilian infrastructure and convoy routing." It was, as bureaucratic understatements go, a considerable one. Patton never mentioned Saint-Éloi-sur-Mer in any of his own accounts, not in his letters, not in his reports, not in the memoir he was working on when he died. The story lived the way certain true things live, not in official channels, not in documented records, but in the particular oral tradition of men who were there and told it to other men who were not, and those men told it again, and the telling stayed close to the facts because the facts were already strange enough to need no decoration. What they all remembered, Hart, Lacroix, Cole in the second truck, the sergeant who had edged forward to watch, the soldiers who saw it from a distance and understood perhaps half of what they were seeing, was the same image. A general with 3 stars on his helmet and a mayor in his good suit, walking in silence along the wall of a church built in 1632, in a village of 180 people on a road in Brittany, in August of 1944. 2 men. 1 road. The patience to walk it together.